Everyone loves a bouquet of fresh flowers, but have you ever wondered where the flowers come from? If you are in Europe, chances are they came from Kenyan soil. The continuous demand for flowers strips resources from water-scarce countries. Kenya is an African country that is dealing with a water crisis of its own. Population growth and a changing climate add pressure on Kenya's finite water resources. Most families in rural Kenya make their living by selling cash crops or by raising livestock. Rural households depend on the fertility of their land to earn a living. This makes water a basic necessity for these communities. Like in other developing countries, the task of collecting water falls on women. Kenyan women collect water 57% of the time, while men collect water only 12% of the time. Women have the primary responsibility of feeding the family, carrying the water, and for sustaining the homestead. Women also recognize the connection between the soil and water, and therefore between income and water. Women react to water scarcity by participating in community efforts to conserve natural resources. Rural women participate in most grassroots level tree planting, as formalized by the Green Belt movement. However, these efforts cannot stand up against commercial farmers' unsustainable use of shared water resources. To look at how commercial farmers are given the power over water resources, we will turn to water reform. The Water Act of 2002 determined who gets access to water in Kenya. The policy was an act of parliament to provide for the management, conservation, use and control of water resources, and for the acquisition and regulation of rights to use water. But the way the Act hopes to do this is through public-private partnership. What this means is that new institutions will handle distributing water to users, while the Kenyan government takes a back seat. The Act created new rules about how water from a river, lake, or reservoir should be distributed. Out of the institutions, we will look at water resource users associations. Water users in a common area will form a WRUA. The participants of the WRUA have to work in cooperation to share, manage, and conserve their common water resource. But who are the winners and the losers of the WRUAs? The institution has different effects on rural farmers and commercial farmers. Wealthy commercial farmers are able to pay for all they need. Rural farmers, who depend on the water for growing their crops and for feeding their families, cannot pay the high price of water. This happens because water is divided on an ability to pay basis, which means that if you have the money, you can have the water. Water is treated as a commodity rather than a necessity. The loudest voice in the WRUA are the large-scale commercial farms that play a leading role in making water decisions. They invite the rural poor to the table, but they do not meaningfully include them in building the table. Commercial farmers continue to extract more water for their exports, while rural farms are left bare. Women are rarely included in decision-making processes, despite being heavily reliant on water resources. It is paradoxical that women who are most involved with water, most knowledgeable about water, and most reliant on water are excluded from leading the conversation. Why are these injustices allowed by an act that sounds good on paper? Underneath the institutional changes, the Water Act is part of a global policy narrative with the aim of opening Kenya and its resources to the world. The Act decentralized water distribution and allowed others to enter the stage. In doing so, commercial enterprises benefit. The Water Act is funded by the World Bank, an international institution that promotes free trade, deregulation, privatization, and reduced expenditure on social services. These neoliberal ideals allow water to irrigate commercial farms instead of attending to the needs of the rural poor and women.
Commercial farming is a lucrative industry in Kenya. The cut flower industry is the third largest industry in Kenya after tourism and tea. Flower farms help the economy by creating jobs and by funding schools and hospitals in nearby areas. Although flower farms help the Kenyan economy, they use up tons of water and hurt rural communities. According to Winona Hodder and Mard Barlow, exporting agriculture harms those who provide the water.
So we've set up this system of agriculture that just doesn't work anymore, and it's really based on the concept of virtual water, where we're growing crops for export in thirsty places and then moving them long distances.
For instance, here in Kenya, they grow most of the roses that are sold in Europe, and they export them. And they're grown around a beautiful, beautiful lake called Lake Naivasha, which is being depleted at an appalling rate.
This lake is the largest freshwater source in the country and connects to other groundwater sources that rural women collect their water from. The unsustainable use of this resource for commercial farming has contaminated the lake tremendously and has reduced the water table. As shown, using water for commercial farming has exacerbated the water scarcity issue. The connected groundwater sources are affected similarly to the lake. When the lake's water table falls, other sources of water falls with it. When the lake is contaminated, other sources of water are contaminated as well. Those who rely most on alternative sources of water, like boreholes, are indigenous groups and rural communities. Since within these communities, women are responsible for collecting water, the disturbance to their water sources may prohibit them from meeting their domestic duties. Women may also have to venture greater distances in order to find a different water source. This has resulted in adverse health effects for some. There is little accountability in this entire process because of how important commercial farms are to Kenya's economy. This issue reflects the world systems theory. The economy of Kenya depends on the economy of the European Union. As long as the demand for flowers is high, the commercial farms will have a market to sell to, and the economy thrives. Yet, while there's some benefit, the theory highlights how the global south is ultimately exploited by the global north. With that being said, let's direct our focus to neoliberalism. This theory links the impact of the Water Act and floriculture. The World Bank made adopting a free market a requirement before funding the Water Act. The World Bank was also influential in the implementation of privatized water. Because of these reforms, the pricing of water was no longer within the government's control. Private stakeholders such as large commercial farms are able to determine the pricing of water. With the elite having the majority of seats in WRUAs, water pricing, as shown, often works in favor of those who are better able to pay. Other private stakeholders include investors from foreign countries such as those in the European Union. When flowers are exported from Kenya, some are brought to the Dutch auctions. Here, the price of the exports are determined based on what foreign investors are willing to pay. As a result, many poor Kenyans are unable to compete with the price. Therefore, in privatizing water and opening Kenya's markets to foreigners, water reforms have paved the way for an unjust distribution of water. These injustices don't have to continue. For the last 4 decades, the Green Belt movement has taken a dual approach in improving the livelihood of rural women. First, in acknowledging that women travel further and further for resources in response to food insecurity and drying streams, members of the movement have restored degraded watersheds, planted trees, and stored rainwater for local communities. Second, members of the movement have advocated for gender equality. These actions show that a solution to the environmental harms does exist. Regardless, environmental conservation should be a widespread effort, not a local one. The day when water reforms acknowledge water as a right rather than water as a commodity is the day that the rural communities of Kenya may finally see distributive justice.